From Pacifica Radio, this is Democracy Now!
I'm Alan Dershowitz, and in my new book, The Case for Israel, I try to make the progressive case for a two-state solution, and I insist that when the Palestinian leadership really wants a Palestinian state more than they want to see the end of the Jewish state of Israel, this century-long conflict, which could have been resolved long ago, will finally be resolved.
Hi, I'm Norm Finkelstein. I read Alan Dershowitz's book twice. I carefully checked the sources, and it's my impression that the book does raise serious questions about his academic integrity, his intellectual honesty, and raises serious questions about whether he's even qualified to teach at Harvard University.
Well, this
Today,
is
a debate on the case for Israel. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Bush returned to the United Nations yesterday for the first time since the U.S. invaded Iraq without UN backing. This time he called for international assistance in the reconstruction of Iraq and to defend Washington's Iraq policy. On Iraq, Bush rejected proposals by France and Germany for power to be quickly transferred from the occupying U.S. and British forces back to the Iraqi people. Bush said the transfer must be, quote, neither hurried nor delayed. Bush also defended the invasion, saying Iraq's former dictator will never again use weapons of mass destruction. A Washington Post analysis found Bush's address left many unanswered questions, including how quickly would the United States grant sovereignty to the Iraqis? Would the administration grant any decision-making role to the United Nations? Or does the administration simply want assistance without giving up much in return? The Bush administration's policy of preemptive attack came under criticism from both Secretary General Kofi Annan and French President Jacques Chirac. Chirac said, quote, the United Nations has just weathered one of its most serious trials in its history. Respect for the UN Charter, the use of force were at the heart of the debate. The war, which was started without the authorization of the Security Council, has shaken the multilateral system. Annan added on preemptive attacks, quote, my concern is that if it were to be adopted, it would set precedents that resulted in a proliferation of the unilateral and lawless use of force with or without justification. Although Annan did not specifically refer to the United States, the New York Times reports he gave the impression that he believed Washington is endangering world peace with its foreign policies. The Washington Post reported Annan and Chirac's addresses received enthusiastic reaction, while Bush received tepid, almost perfunctory applause for his presentation. A lead editorial in the Washington Post was headlined, A Failed Speech. Slate.com headlined their coverage, Bush to the World, Drop Dead. Analysts predict support from the international community will be far less than Washington hoped. One diplomat told the New York Times, quote, the situation in Iraq is getting more difficult every day, and so is the atmosphere at the United Nations. A federal appeals court yesterday ruled California's recall vote can go ahead as originally planned on October 7th, reversing another court order that would have delayed the election until March. The American Civil Liberties Union, which called for the delay because some voting districts will still be using faulty voting machines, announced it would not appeal yesterday's decision. The court unanimously ruled that federal courts, quote, cannot lightly interfere with state elections. In addition, the court noted that hundreds of thousands of Californians had already voted by absentee ballot. Meanwhile, Republican legislator Darrell Issa, who bankrolled the recall, said he would urge Californians to vote to keep Governor Gray Davis in office if both Republican frontrunner State Senator Tom McClintock and Arnold Schwarzenegger remain in the race. Issa said the two Republicans would split the GOP vote and give the election to Democrat Cruz Bustamante, who Issa described as worse than Davis. For the second time this month, the U.S. military has arrested one of its own at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, where it's holding over 600 detainees captured in Afghanistan and elsewhere. The Pentagon announced yesterday senior Air Force Airman Ahmad al-Halabi faces 32 criminal charges related to spying. Although al-Halabi, who worked as a translator, is being charged with giving classified information from the prison to Syria. On September 10th, Army Chaplain James Yee was arrested, but charges have not yet been filed. Iraq's U.S.-appointed governing council yesterday banned the Arab satellite television stations Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya from covering the council's news conferences and entering government ministries for 2 weeks. The council said the stations had committed irresponsible activities that threaten the country's, quote, democracy and stability. In other Iraq news, 2 commuter buses in Iraq were bombed today, killing a 17-year-old and injuring at least 12. CNN reports the bombs were intended for U.S. military vehicles. Meanwhile, the Associated Press is protesting the treatment of one of its photographers in Iraq after U.S. soldiers detained the journalist and his driver for 3 hours in 110-degree heat. They were handcuffed and denied water and use of a telephone. In other news, award-winning Los Angeles Times foreign correspondent Mark Feynman died Monday at the age of 51 after suffering a heart attack yesterday in Baghdad, where he was working. Out of Nowhere by saxophonist Frank Lowe with drummer Philip Wilson. Frank Lowe died Friday at the age of 60 in New York. You are listening to Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A 15-year-old unarmed Palestinian boy was killed and 14 Palestinians wounded when Palestinian militants and Israeli forces clashed in the southern Gaza Strip today. 20 Israeli tanks and bulldozers entered the Rafah refugee camp shortly after midnight, after 5 mortar shells were fired at a block of Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip. No injuries or damage was reported. Meanwhile, Israeli Foreign Minister Silvan Shalom is scheduled to meet U.S. National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice and Secretary of State General Colin Powell today to discuss the U.S. position on the route of the so-called security fence in the West Bank. Prior to the meetings, Shalom said during an interview on the fence that Israel should, quote, do everything to defend as many West Bank settlers as possible, and said the purpose of the fence is to defend Israeli citizens. Meanwhile, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz is reporting the Israeli government spends at least $560 million a year on subsidies, infrastructure, and education for 220,000 Jewish settlers living in the West Bank and Gaza. The figure does not include military spending in those areas. Haaretz says Israel has spent at least $10.1 billion on the settlement since capturing the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. Successive Israeli governments have refused to disclose how much they spend on settlements. Haaretz says it compiled the figure after 3 months of research, including interviews with dozens of government officials and experts. And yesterday, President Bush told the 58th session of the United Nations General Assembly, quote, the Palestinian cause is betrayed by leaders who cling to power by feeding old hatreds and destroying the good work of others. This comes days after the UN voted 133-4 to condemn Israel's decision to, quote, remove Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. The United States, Israel, the Marshall Islands, and Micronesia voted against the measure. Well,